Welcome to the Voxlore. Our channel produces immersive fantasy audiobooks for entertainment and storytelling enjoyment. All content, including narration, sound design, and storytelling elements, is created with passion for fantasy fans. The Crisis, by Winston Churchill, Part 4, Chapter 16, in which Stephen learns something. It was Mr. Lincoln who brought him back. The astonishing candidate for the Senate had sunk into his chair. His face relaxed into sadness save for the sparkle lurking in the eyes. So he sat, immobile, until the laughter had died down to silence. Then he turned to Stephen. "Sonny," he said, "did you want to see me?" Stephen was determined to be affable and kind, and, shall we say it, he would not make Mr. Lincoln uncomfortable either by a superiority of English or the certain frigidity of manner which people in the West said he had. But he tried to imagine a Massachusetts senator, Mr. Sumner, for instance, going through the rat story, and couldn't. Somehow, Massachusetts senators hadn't this gift. And yet he was not quite sure that it wasn't a fetching gift. Stephen did not quite like to be called Sonny, but he looked into two gray eyes, and at the face, and something curious happened to him. How was he to know that thousands of his countrymen were to experience the same sensation? "Sonny," said Mr. Lincoln again, "did you want to see me?" "Yes, sir." Stephen wondered at the sir. It had been involuntary. He drew from his inner pocket the envelope which the judge had given him. Mr. Lincoln ripped it open. A document fell out and a letter. He put the document in his tall hat, which was upside down on the floor. As he got deeper into the letter, he pursed his mouth, and the lines of his face deepened in a smile. Then he looked up, grave again. "Judge Whipple told you to run till you found me. Did he, Mr. Bryce?" "Yes, sir." "Is the judge the same old crisscross, contrary, violent fool that he always was?" Providence put an answer in Stephen's mouth. "He's been very good to me, Mr. Lincoln." Mr. Lincoln broke into laughter. "Why, he's the biggest-hearted man I know. You know him, Oglesby, Silas Whipple. But a man has to be a Daniel or a General Putnam to venture into that den of his. There's only one man in the world who can beard Silas, and he's the finest states-right Southern gentleman you ever saw. I mean Colonel Carville. You've heard of him, Oglesby. Don't they quarrel once in a while, Mr. Bryce?" "They do have occasional arguments," said Stephen, amused. "Arguments?" cried Mr. Lincoln. "Well, I couldn't come as near to fighting every day and stand it. If my dog and Bill's dog across the street walked around each other and growled for half a day, and then lay down together as Carville and Whipple do, by jing, I'd put pepper on their noses." "I reckon Colonel Carville isn't a fighting man," said someone at random. Strangely enough, Stephen was seized with a desire to vindicate the colonel's courage. Both Mr. Lincoln and Judge Oglesby forestalled him. "Not a fighting man!" exclaimed the judge. "Why, the other day—" "Now, Oglesby," put in Mr. Lincoln, "I wanted to tell that story. Stephen had heard it, and so have we." But Mr. Lincoln's imitation of the colonel's drawl brought him a pang like homesickness. "No, Sue, I didn't intend to shoot. Not if he had gone off straight. But he wriggled and twisted like a rattlesnake, and I just couldn't resist, Sue. Then I sent Nigger Ephraim to tell him not to let me catch sight of him round the planter's house. Yes, Sue, that's what he was. One of these damned Yankees who come south and go into nigger deals and politics." Mr. Lincoln glanced at Stephen, and then again at the judge's letter. He took up his silk hat and thrust that, too, into the worn lining, which was already filled with papers. He clapped the hat on his head and buttoned on his collar. "I reckon I'll go for a walk, boys," he said, "and clear my head, so as to be ready for the little giant tomorrow at Freeport. Mr. Bryce, do you feel like walking?" Stephen, taken aback, said that he did. "Now, Abe, this is just derned foolishness," one of the gentlemen expostulated. "We want to know if you're going to ask Douglas that question." "If you do, you kill yourself, Lincoln," said another, who Stephen afterwards learned was Mr. Medill, proprietor of the great Press and Tribune. "I guess I'll risk it, Joe," said Mr. Lincoln gravely. Suddenly comes the quiver about the corners of his mouth, and the gray eyes respond. "Boys," said he, Did you ever hear the story of Farmer Bell, down in Egypt? I'll tell it to you, boys, and then perhaps you'll know why I'll ask Judge Douglas that question. Farmer Bell had the prize Bartlett pear tree, and the prettiest gal in that section. And he thought about the same of each of them. All the boys were after Sue Bell, but there was only one who had any chance of getting her, and his name was Jim Ricketts. Jim was the handsomest man in that section. He's been hung since. But Jim had a good deal out of life, all the appetites and some of the gratifications. He liked Sue and he liked a luscious Bartlett, and he intended to have both. And it just so happened that that prize pear tree had a whopper on that year, and Old Man Bell couldn't talk of anything else. Now there was an ugly galoot whose name isn't worth mentioning. He knew he wasn't in any way fit for Sue, and he liked pears about as well as Jim Ricketts. Well, one night here comes Jim along the road, whistling, to court Susan, and there was the ugly galoot a-yearning on the bank under the pear tree. Jim was all fixed up, and he says to the galoot, "Let's have a throw." Now the galoot knew Old Bell was looking over the fence, so he says, "All right," and he gives Jim the first shot. Jim fetched down the big pear, got his teeth in it, and strolled off to the house, kind of pitiful of the galoot for a half-witted ass. When he got to the door, there was the old man. "What are you here for?" says he. "Why," says Ricketts in his offhand way, for he always had great confidence, "to fetch Sue. The old man used to wear brass toes to keep his boots from wearing out," said Mr. Lincoln dreamily. "You see," continued Mr. Lincoln, "you see the galoot knew that Jim Ricketts wasn't to be trusted with Susan Bell." Some of the gentlemen appeared to see the point of this political parable, for they laughed uproariously. The others laughed too. Then they slapped their knees, looked at Mr. Lincoln's face, which was perfectly sober, and laughed again, a little fainter. Then the judge looked as solemn as his title. "It won't do, Abe," said he. "You commit suicide. You'd better stick to the pear, Abe," said Mr. Medill, "and fight Stephen A. Douglas here and now. This isn't any picnic. Do you know who he is?" "Why, yes, Joe," said Mr. Lincoln amiably. "He's a man with tens of thousands of blind followers. It's my business to make some of those blind followers see." By this time Stephen was burning to know the question that Mr. Lincoln wished to ask the little giant, and why the other gentlemen were against it. But Mr. Lincoln surprised him still further in taking him by the arm. Turning to the young reporter, Mr. Hill, who had finished his writing, he said, "Bob, a little air will do you good. I've had enough of the old boys for a while, and I'm going to talk to somebody any own age." Stephen was halfway down the corridor when he discovered that he had forgotten his hat. As he returned, he heard somebody say, "If that ain't just like Abe." He stopped to pull a flea out of his stocking when he was going to fight that duel with Shields, and now he's walking with boys before a debate with the smartest man in this country. And there's heaps of things he ought to discuss with us. "Reckon we haven't got much to do with it," said another, half laughing, half rueful. "There's some things Abe won't stand." From the stairs Stephen saw Mr. Lincoln threading his way through the crowd below, laughing at one, pausing to lay his hand on the shoulder of another, and replying to a rough sally of a third to make the place a tumult of guffaws. But none had the temerity to follow him. When Stephen caught up with him in the little country street, he was talking earnestly to Mr. Hill, the young reporter of the Press and Tribune. And what do you think was the subject? The red comet in the sky that night. Stephen kept pace in silence with Mr. Lincoln's strides, another shock in store for him. This rail-splitter, this postmaster, this flatboatman, whom he had not credited with a knowledge of the new code, was talking astronomy. And strange to say, Mr. Bryce was learning. "Bob," said Mr. Lincoln, "can you elucidate the problem of the three bodies?" To Stephen's surprise, Mr. Hill elucidated. The talk then fell upon novels and stories, a few of which Mr. Lincoln seemed to have read. He spoke, among others, of the gold bug. "The story is grand," said he, "but it might as well have been written of Robinson Crusoe's island. What a fellow wants in a book is to know where he is. There are not many novels, or ancient works for that matter, that put you down anywhere. There is that genuine fragment which Cicero has preserved from a last work of Aristotle," said Mr. Hill slyly. "If there were beings who lived in the depths of the earth, and could emerge through the open fissures, and could suddenly behold the earth, the sea, and the vault of heaven. "But you impostor," cried Mr. Lincoln, interrupting. "You're giving us Humboldt's cosmos." Mr. Hill owned up, laughing. "It is remarkable how soon we accustom ourselves to a strange situation." And to Stephen it was no less strange to be walking over a muddy road of the prairie with this most singular man and a newspaper correspondent, than it might have been to the subterrestrial inhabitant to emerge on the earth's surface. Stephen's mind was in the process of a chemical change. Suddenly it seemed to him as if he had known this tall Illinoisan always. The whim of the senatorial candidate in choosing him for a companion he did not then try to account for. "Come, Mr. Stephen," said Mr. Lincoln presently. "Where do you hail from?" "Boston," said Stephen. "No," said Mr. Lincoln incredulously. "And how does it happen that you come to me with a message from a rank abolitionist lawyer in St. Louis? Is the judge a friend of yours, sir?" Stephen asked. "What?" exclaimed Mr. Lincoln. "Didn't he tell you he was?" "He said nothing at all, sir, except to tell me to travel until I found you." "I call the judge a friend of mine," said Mr. Lincoln. "He may not claim me because I do not believe in putting all slave owners to the sword. I do not think that Judge Whipple is precisely an abolitionist, sir." "What? And how do you feel, Mr. Stephen?" Stephen replied in figures. It was rare with him, and he must have caught it from Mr. Lincoln. "I am not for ripping out the dam suddenly, sir. That would drown the nation. I believe that the water can be drained off in some other way." Mr. Lincoln's direct answer to this was to give Stephen stinging slap between the shoulder blades. "God bless the boy," he cried. "He has thought it out. Bob, take that down for the Press and Tribune as coming from a rising young politician of St. Louis." "Why," Stephen blurted out, I thought you were an abolitionist, Mr. Lincoln." "Mr. Bryce," said Mr. Lincoln, "I have as much use for the Boston Liberator as I have for the Charleston Courier. You may guess how much that is. The question is not whether we shall or shall not have slavery, but whether slavery shall stay where it is, or be extended according to Judge Douglas's ingenious plan. The judge is for breeding worms. I am for cauterizing the sore so that it shall not spread. But I tell you, Mr. Bryce, that this nation cannot exist half slave and half free." Was it the slap on the back that opened Stephen's eyes? It was certain that, as they returned to the tavern, the man at his side was changed. He need not have felt chagrined. Men in high places underestimated Lincoln, or did not estimate him at all. Affection came first. The great warm heart had claimed Stephen as it claimed all who came near it. The tavern was deserted save for a few stragglers. Under the dim light at the bar, Mr. Lincoln took off his hat and drew the judge's letter from the lining. "Mr. Stephen," said he, "would you like to come to Freeport with me tomorrow and hear the debate?" An hour earlier he would have declined with thanks. But now his face lighted at the prospect, and suddenly fell again. Mr. Lincoln guessed the cause. He laid his hand on the young man's shoulder and laughed. "I reckon you're thinking of what the judge will say." Stephen smiled. "I'll take care of the judge," said Mr. Lincoln. "I'm not afraid of him." He drew forth from the inexhaustible hat a slip of paper and began to write. "There," said he when he had finished. "A friend of mine is going to Springfield in the morning, and he'll send that to the judge." It is worth remarking that this was the first time Mr. Bryce had been called Steve, and had not resented it. Stephen was embarrassed. He tried to thank Mr. Lincoln, but that gentleman's quizzical look cut him short, and the next remark made him gasp. "Look here, Steve," said he. "You know a parlor from a drawing room. What did you think of me when you saw me tonight?" Stephen blushed furiously, and his tongue clave to the roof of his mouth. "I'll tell you," said Mr. Lincoln with his characteristic smile. "You thought that you wouldn't pick me out of a bunch of horses to race with the senator." Chapter 17. The Question. Many times since Abraham Lincoln has been called to that mansion which God has reserved for the patriots who have served him also, Stephen Bryce has thought of that steaming night in the low-ceiled room of the country tavern, reeking with the smell of coarse food and hot humanity. He remembers vividly how at first his gorge rose, and recalls how gradually there crept over him a forgetfulness of the squalidity and discomfort. Then came a space gray with puzzling wonder. Then the dawning of a worship for a very ugly man in a rumpled and ill-made coat. You will perceive that there was hope for Stephen. On his shakedown that night, oblivious to the snores of his companions and the droning of the insects, he lay awake, and before his eyes was that strange, marked face, with its deep lines that blended both humor and sadness there. It was homely, and yet Stephen found himself reflecting that honesty was just as homely, and plain truth. And yet both were beautiful to those who had learned to love them. Just so this Mr. Lincoln. He fell asleep wondering why Judge Whipple had sent him. It was in accord with nature that reaction came with the morning. Such a morning, and such a place. He was awakened, shivering, by the beat of rain on the roof, and stumbling over the prostrate forms of the 4 Beaver brothers, reached the window. Clouds filled the sky, and Joshua, whose pallet was under the sill, was in a blessed state of moisture. No wonder some of his enthusiasm had trickled away. He made his toilet in the wet under the pump outside, where he had to wait his turn, and he rather wished he were going back to St. Louis. He had an early breakfast of fried eggs and underdone bacon, and coffee which made him pine for Hester's. The dishes were neither too clean nor too plentiful, being doused in water as soon as ever they were out of use. But after breakfast the sun came out, and a crowd collected around the tavern, although the air was chill and the muck deep in the street. Stephen caught glimpses of Mr. Lincoln towering above the knots of country politicians who surrounded him, and every once in a while a knot would double up with laughter. There was no sign that the senatorial aspirant took the situation seriously, that the coming struggle with his skillful antagonist was weighing him down in the least. Stephen held aloof from the groups, thinking that Mr. Lincoln had forgotten him. He decided to leave for St. Louis on the morning train, and was even pushing toward the tavern entrance with his bag in his hand, when he was met by Mr. Hill. "I had about given you up, Mr. Bryce," he said. "Mr. Lincoln asked me to get hold of you, and bring you to him alive or dead." Accordingly Stephen was led to the station, where a long train of 12 cars was pulled up, covered with flags and bunting. On entering one of these, he perceived Mr. Lincoln sprawled. He could think of no other word to fit the attitude, on a seat next the window, and next him was Mr. Medill of the Press and Tribune. The seat just in front was reserved for Mr. Hill, who was to make any notes necessary. Mr. Lincoln looked up. His appearance was even less attractive than the night before, as he had on a dirty gray linen duster. "I thought you'd got loose, Steve," he said, holding out his hand. "Glad to see you. Just you sit down there next to Bob, where I can talk to you." Stephen sat down, diffident, for he knew that there were others in that train who would give 10 years of their lives for that seat. "I've taken a shine to this Bostonian, Joe," said Mr. Lincoln to Mr. Medill. "We've got to catch 'em young to do anything with them, you know. Now, Steve, just give me a notion how politics are over in St. Louis. What do they think of our new Republican Party? Too brand new for old St. Louis?" Stephen saw expostulation in Mr. Medill's eyes, and hesitated. And Mr. Lincoln seemed to feel Medill's objections, as by mental telepathy. But he said, "We'll come to that little matter later, Joe, when the cars start." Naturally, Stephen began uneasily, but under the influence of that kindly eye he thawed, and forgot himself. He felt that this man was not one to feign an interest. The shouts of the people on the little platform interrupted the account, and the engine staggered off with its load. "I reckon St. Louis is a nest of Southern Democrats," Mr. Lincoln remarked, "and not much opposition." "There are quite a few old-line Whigs, sir," ventured Stephen, smiling. "Joe," said Mr. Lincoln, "did you ever hear Warfield's definition of an old-line Whig?" Mr. Medill had not. "A man who takes his toddy regularly, and votes the Democratic ticket occasionally, and who wears ruffled shirts." Both of these gentlemen laughed, and 2 more in the seat behind, who had an ear to the conversation. "But, sir," said Stephen, seeing that he was expected to go on, "I think that the Republican Party will gather a considerable strength there in another year or 2. We have the material for powerful leaders in Mr. Blair and others." Mr. Lincoln nodded at the name. We are getting an ever-increasing population from New England, mostly of young men who will take kindly to the new party. And then he added, thinking of his pilgrimage the Sunday before, South St. Louis is a solid mass of Germans, who are all anti-slavery, but they are very foreign still, and have all their German institutions. The Turner Halls? Mr. Lincoln surprised him by inquiring. Yes, and I believe that they drill there. Then they will the more easily be turned into soldiers if the time should come, said Mr. Lincoln. And he added quickly, I pray that it may not. Stephen had cause to remember that observation, and the acumen it showed, long afterward. The train made several stops, and at each of them shoals of country people filled the aisles, and paused for a most familiar chat with the senatorial candidate. Many called him Abe. His appearance was the equal in roughness to theirs. His manner, if anything, was more democratic. Yet in spite of all this, Stephen in them detected a deference which might almost be termed a homage. There were many women among them. Had our friend been older, he might have known that the presence of good women in a political crowd portends something. As it was, he was surprised. He was destined to be still more surprised that day. When they had left behind them the shouts of the little town of Dixon, Mr. Lincoln took off his hat, and produced a crumpled and not too immaculate scrap of paper from the multitude therein. Now, Joe, said he, here are the 4 questions I intend to ask Judge Douglas. I am ready for you. Fire away. We don't care anything about the others, answered Mr. Medill. But I tell you this, if you ask that second one, you'll never see the United States Senate. And the Republican Party in this state will have had a blow from which it can scarcely recover, added Mr. Judd, chairman of the committee. Mr. Lincoln did not appear to hear them. His eyes were far away over the wet prairie. Stephen held his breath, but neither he, nor Medill, nor Judd, nor Hill guessed at the pregnancy of that moment. How were they to know that the fate of the United States of America was concealed in that question? Was to be decided on a rough wooden platform that day in the town of Freeport, Illinois. But Abraham Lincoln, the uncouth man in the linen duster with the tousled hair, knew it, and the stone that was rejected of the builders was to become the cornerstone of the temple. Suddenly Mr. Lincoln recalled himself, glanced at the paper, and cleared his throat. In measured tones, plainly heard above the rush and roar of the train, he read the question. Can the people of a United States territory in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state? Constitution? Mr. Medill listened intently. Abe, said he solemnly, Douglas will answer yes or equivocate, and that is all the assurance these Northern Democrats want to put Steve Douglas in the Senate. They'll snow you under. All right, answered Mr. Lincoln quietly. All right? Asked Mr. Medill, reflecting the sheer astonishment of the others. Then why the devil are you wearing yourself out? And why are we spending our time and money on you? Mr. Lincoln laid his hand on Medill's sleeve. Joe, said he, a rat in the larder is easier to catch than a rat that has the run of the cellar. You know where to set your trap in the larder. I'll tell you why I'm in this campaign. To catch Douglas now, and keep him out of the White House in 1860. To save this country of ours, Joe. She's sick. There was a silence, broken by 2 exclamations. But see here, Abe, said Mr. Medill as soon as ever he got his breath. What have we got to show for it? Where do you come in? Mr. Lincoln smiled wearily. Nowhere, I reckon, he answered simply. Good Lord, said Mr. Judd. Mr. Medill gulped. You mean to say, as the candidate of the Republican Party, you don't care whether you get to the Senate? Not if I can send Steve Douglas there with his wings broken, was the calm reply. Suppose he does answer yes, that slavery can be excluded? Said Mr. Judd. Then, said Mr. Lincoln, then Douglas loses the vote of the great slaveholders, the vote of the solid South, that he has been fostering ever since he has had the itch to be president. Without the solid South, the little giant will never live in the White House. And unless I'm mightily mistaken, Steve Douglas has had his eye as far ahead as 1860 for some time. Another silence followed these words. There was a stout man standing in the aisle, and he spat deftly out of the open window. "You may wing Steve Douglas, Abe," said he gloomily, "but the gun will kick you over the bluff." "Don't worry about me, Ed," said Mr. Lincoln. "I'm not worth it." In a wave of comprehension, the significance of all this was revealed to Stephen Bryce, the grim humor, the sagacious statesmanship, and, best of all, the superb self-sacrifice of it, struck him suddenly. I think it was in that hour that he realized the full extent of the wisdom he was near, which was like unto Solomon's. Shame surged in Stephen's face that he should have misjudged him. He had come to patronize. He had remained to worship. And in after years, when he thought of this new vital force which became part of him that day, it was in the terms of Emerson. Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates and Jesus and Luther and Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. How many have conversed with Lincoln before and since, and knew him not? If an outward and visible sign of Mr. Lincoln's greatness were needed, he had chosen to speak to them in homely parables. The story of Farmer Bell was plain as day. Jim Ricketts, who had life all his own way, was none other than Stephen A. Douglas, the easily successful. The ugly galoot, who dared to raise his eyes only to the pear, was Mr. Lincoln himself. And the pear was the senatorship, which the galoot had denied himself to save Susan from being Mr. Ricketts' bride. Stephen could understand likewise the vehemence of the Republican leaders who crowded around their candidate and tried to get him to retract that question. He listened quietly, he answered with a patient smile. Now and then he threw a story into the midst of this discussion which made them laugh in spite of themselves. The hopelessness of the case was quite plain to Mr. Hill, who smiled and whispered in Stephen's ear. "He has made up his mind. They will not budge him an inch, and they know it." Finally Mr. Lincoln took the scrap of paper, which was even more dirty and finger-marked by this time, and handed it to Mr. Hill. The train was slowing down for Freeport. In the distance, bands could be heard playing, and along the track, line upon line of men and women were cheering and waving. It was 10 o'clock, raw and cold for that time of the year, and the sun was trying to come out. "Bob," said Mr. Lincoln, "be sure you get that right in your notes. And Steve, you stick close to me and you'll see the show. Why, boys," he added, smiling, "there's the great man's private car, cannon and all." All that Stephen saw was a regular day car on a sidetrack. A brass cannon was on the tender hitched behind it. Chapter 18. The Crisis. Stephen A. Douglas, called the Little Giant on account of his intellect, was a type of man of which our race has had some notable examples, although they are not characteristic. Capable of sacrifice to their country, personal ambition is, nevertheless, the mainspring of their actions. They must either be before the public or else unhappy. This trait gives them a large theatrical strain, and sometimes brands them as adventurers. Their ability saves them from being demagogues. In the case of Douglas, he had deliberately renewed some years before the agitation on the spread of slavery, by setting forth a doctrine of extreme cleverness. This doctrine, like many others of its kind, seemed at first sight to be the balm it pretended, instead of an irritant as it really was. It was calculated to deceive all except thinking men, and to silence all save a merciless logician. And this merciless logician, who was heaven-sent in time of need, was Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Douglas was a juggler, a political prestidigitator. He did things before the eyes of the Senate and the nation. His balm for the healing of the nation's wounds was a patent medicine so cleverly concocted that experts alone could show what was in it. So abstruse and twisted were some of Mr. Douglas's doctrines that a genius alone might put them into simple words, for the common people. The great panacea for the slavery trouble put forth by Mr. Douglas at that time was briefly this, that the people of the new territories should decide for themselves, subject to the Constitution, whether they should have slavery or not, and also decide for themselves all other questions under the Constitution. Unhappily for Mr. Douglas, there was the famous Dred Scott decision, which had set the South wild with joy the year before, and had cast a gloom over the North. The Chief Justice of the United States had declared that under the Constitution slaves were property, and as such every American citizen owning slaves could carry them about with him wherever he went. Therefore the territorial legislatures might pass laws until they were dumb, and yet their settlers might bring with them all the slaves they pleased. And yet we must love the judge. He was a gentleman, a strong man, and a patriot. He was magnanimous, and to his immortal honor be it said that he, in the end, won the greatest of all struggles. He conquered himself. He put down that mightiest thing that was in him, his ambition for himself, and he set up, instead, his ambition for his country. He bore no ill will toward the man whose fate was so strangely linked to his, and who finally came to that high seat of honor and of martyrdom which he coveted. We shall love the judge, and speak of him with reverence, for that sublime act of kindness before the Capitol in 1861. Abraham Lincoln might have prayed on that day of the Freeport debate, "Forgive him, Lord. He knows not what he does." Lincoln descried the danger afar, and threw his body into the breach. That which passed before Stephen's eyes, and to which his ears listened at Freeport, was the great republic pressing westward to the Pacific. He wondered whether some of his Eastern friends who pursed their lips when the rest was mentioned would have sneered or prayed. A young English nobleman who was there that day did not sneer. He was filled instead with something like awe at the vigor of this nation which was sprung from the loins of his own. Crudeness he saw, vulgarity he heard, but force he felt, and marveled. America was in Freeport that day, the rush of her people and the surprise of her climate. The rain had ceased, and quickly was come out of the northwest a boisterous wind, chilled by the lakes and scented by the hemlocks of the Minnesota forests. The sun smiled and frowned, clouds hurried in the sky, mocking the human hubbub below. Cheering thousands pressed about the station as Mr. Lincoln's train arrived. They hemmed him in his triumphal passage under the great arching trees to the new Brewster House. The chief marshal and his aides, great men before, were suddenly immortal. The county delegations fell into their proper precedence like ministers at a state dinner. We have faith in Abraham, yet another county for the rail sputter, Abe the giant killer. So the banners read. Here, much bedecked, was the Galena Lincoln Club, part of Joe Davies's shipment. Fifes skirled, and drums throbbed, and the stars and stripes snapped in the breeze. And here was a delegation headed by 50 sturdy ladies on horseback, at whom Stephen gaped like a countryman. Then came carryalls of all ages and degrees, wagons from this county and that county, giddily draped, drawn by horses from 1 to 6, or by mules, their inscriptions addressing their senatorial candidate in all degrees of familiarity, but not contempt. What they seemed proudest of was that he had been a rail splitter, for nearly all bore a fence rail. But stay, what is this wagon with the high sapling flagstaff in the middle, and the leaves still on it? Westward the star of empire takes its way. The girls link on to Lincoln. Their mothers were for Clay. Here was glory to blind you. 32 maids in red sashes and blue liberty caps with white stars. Each was a state of the Union, and every one of them was for Abraham, who called them his basket of flowers. Behind them, most touching of all, sat a 33rd shackled in chains. That was Kansas. Alas, the men of Kansas was far from being as sorrowful as the part demanded. In spite of her instructions, she would smile at the boys. But the appealing inscription she bore, "Set me free," was greeted with storms of laughter, the boldest of the young men shouting that she was too beautiful to be free, and some of the old men, to their shame be it said, likewise shouted. No false embarrassment troubled Kansas. She was openly pleased. But the young men who had brought their sweethearts to town, and were standing hand in hand with them, for obvious reasons saw nothing. They scarcely dared to look at Kansas, and those who did were so loudly rebuked that they turned down the side streets. During this part of the day these loving couples, whose devotion was so patent to the whole world, were by far the most absorbing to Stephen. He watched them having their fortunes told, the young women blushing and crying, "Say, and ain't he wicked?" and the young men getting their ears boxed for certain remarks. He watched them standing open-mouthed at the booths and sideshows with hands still locked, or again they were chewing cream candy in unison, or he glanced sidewise at them, seated in the open places with the world so far below them that even the insistent sound of the fifes and drums rose but faintly to their ears. And perhaps, we shall not say positively, perhaps Mr. Bryce's thoughts went something like this: "Oh, that love were so simple a matter to all, but graven on his face was what is called the Boston scorn. And no scorn has been known like unto it since the days of Athens. So Stephen made the best of his way to the Brewster house, the elegance and newness of which the citizens of Freeport openly boasted. Mr. Lincoln had preceded him, and was even then listening to a few remarks of burning praise by an honorable gentleman. Mr. Lincoln himself made a few remarks, which seemed so simple and rang so true, and were so free from political rococo and decoration generally, that even the young men forgot their sweethearts to listen. Then Mr. Lincoln went into the hotel, and the sun slipped under a black cloud. The lobby was full, and rather dirty, since the supply of spittoons was so far behind the demand. Like the firmament, it was divided into little bodies which revolved about larger bodies. But there lacked not here supporters of the little giant, and discreet farmers of influence in their own counties who waited to hear the afternoon's debate before deciding. These and others did not hesitate to tell of the magnificence of the little giant's torchlight procession the previous evening. Every Dred Scottite had carried a torch, and many transparencies, so that the very glory of it had turned night into day. The chief lictor had distributed these torches with an unheard-of liberality. But there lacked not detractors who swore that John Dibble and other Lincolnites had applied for torches for the mere pleasure of carrying them. Since dawn the delegations had been heralded from the housetops, and wagered on while they were yet as worms far out o'er the prairie. All the morning these continued to come in, and form in line to march past their particular candidate. The second great event of the day was the event of the special over the Galena roar, of 16 cars and more than 1,000 pairs of sovereign lungs. With military precision they repaired to the Brewster house, and ahead of them a banner was flung, Winnebago County for the tall sucker, and the tall sucker was on the steps to receive them. But Mr. Douglas, who had arrived the evening before to the booming of 32 guns, had his banners and his bunting too. The neighborhood of Freeport was stronghold of Northern Democrats, ardent supporters of the little giant if once they could believe that he did not intend to betray them. Stephen felt in his bones the coming of a struggle, and was thrilled. Once he smiled at the thought that he had become an active partisan, nay, a worshipper of the uncouth Lincoln. Terrible suspicion for a Bostonian. Had he been carried away? Was his hero, after all, a homespun demagogue? Had he been wise in deciding before he had caught a glimpse of the accomplished Douglas, whose name and fame filled the land? Stephen did not waver in his allegiance. But in his heart there lurked a fear of the sophisticated judge and senator and man of the world whom he had not yet seen. In his notebook he had made a copy of the question, and young Mr. Hill discovered him pondering in a corner of the lobby at dinner-time. After dinner they went together to their candidate's room. They found the doors open and the place packed, and there was Mr. Lincoln's very tall hat towering above those of the other politicians pressed around him. Mr. Lincoln took 3 strides in Stephen's direction and seized him by the shoulder. "Why, Steve," said he, "I thought you had got away again." Turning to a big burly man with a good-natured face, who was standing by, he added, "Jim, I want you to look out for this young man. Get him a seat on the stands where he can hear." Stephen stuck close to Jim. He never knew what the gentleman's last name was, or whether he had any. It was but a few minutes' walk to the grove where the speaking was to be, and as they made their way thither Mr. Lincoln passed them in a Conestoga wagon drawn by 6 milk-white horses. Jim informed Stephen that the little giant had had a 6-horse coach. The grove was black with people. Hovering about the hem of the crowd were the sunburned young men in their Sunday best, still clinging fast to the hands of the young women. Bands blared Columbia, Gem of the Ocean. Fakirs planted their stands in the way, selling painkillers and ague cures, watermelons and lemonade. Jugglers juggled, and beggars begged. Jim said that there were 16,000 people in that grove, and he told the truth. Stephen now trembled for his champion. He tried to think of himself as 50 years old, with the courage to address 16,000 people on such a day, and quailed. What a man of affairs it must take to do that. 16,000 people, into each of whose breasts God had put different emotions and convictions. He had never even imagined such a crowd as this assembles merely to listen to a political debate. But then he remembered, as they dodged from in front of the horses, what it was not merely a political debate, The pulse of nation was here, a great nation stricken with approaching fever. It was not now a case of excise, but of existence. This son of toil who had driven his family 30 miles across the prairie, blanketed his tired horses and slept on the ground the night before, who was willing to stand all through the afternoon and listen with pathetic eagerness to this debate, must be moved by a patriotism divine. In the breast of that farmer, in the breast of his tired wife who held her child by the hand, had been instilled from birth that sublime fervor which is part of their life who inherit the Declaration of Independence. Instinctively these men who had fought and won the West had scented the danger. With the spirit of their ancestors who had left their farms to die on the bridge at Concord, or follow Ethan Allen into Ticonderoga, these had come to Freeport. What were 3 days of bodily discomfort? What even the loss of part of a cherished crop, if the nation's existence were at stake and their votes might save it? In the midst of that heaving human sea rose the bulwarks of a wooden stand. But how to reach it? Jim was evidently a personage. The rough farmers commonly squeezed a way for him, and when they did not, he made it with his big body. As they drew near their haven, a great surging as of a tidal wave swept them off their feet. There was a deafening shout, and the stand rocked on its foundations. Before Stephen could collect his wits, a fierce battle was raging about him. Abolitionist and Democrat, free soiler and squatter SOV, defaced one another in a rush for the platform. The committeemen and reporters on top of it rose to its defense. Well for Stephen that his companion was along. Jim was recognized and hauled bodily into the fort, and Stephen after him. The populace were driven off, and when the excitement died down again, he found himself in the row behind the reporters. Young Mr. Hill paused while sharpening his pencil to wave him a friendly greeting. Stephen, craning in his seat, caught sight of Mr. Lincoln slouched into one of his favorite attitudes, his chin resting in his hand. But who is this, erect, compact, aggressive, searching with a confident eye the wilderness of upturned faces? A personage, truly, to be questioned timidly, to be approached advisedly. Here indeed was a lion, by the very look of him, master of himself and of others. By reason of its regularity and masculine strength, a handsome face. A man of the world to the cut of the coat across the broad shoulders. Here was one to lift a youngster into the realm of emulation, like a character in a play, to arouse dreams of Washington and its senators and great men. For this was one to be consulted by the great alone. A figure of dignity and power, with magnetism to compel moods. Since, when he smiled, you warmed in spite of yourself, and when he frowned the world looked grave. The inevitable comparison was come, and Stephen's hero was shrunk once more. He drew a deep breath, searched for the word, and gulped. There was but the one word. How country Abraham Lincoln looked beside Stephen Arnold Douglas. Had the Lord ever before made and set over against each other two such different men? Yes, for such are the ways of the Lord. The preliminary speaking was in progress, but Stephen neither heard nor saw until he felt the heavy hand of his companion on his knee. There's something mighty strange, like fate, between them two, he was saying. I recollect 25 years ago when they was first in the legislature together. A man told me that they was both admitted to practice in the Supreme Court in '39 on the same day, sir. Then you know they was nip and tuck after the same young lady. Got her. They've been in Congress together, the little giant in the Senate, and now, here they be in the greatest set of debates the people of this state ever heard. Young man, the hand of fate is in this here, mark my words. There was a hush, and the waves of that vast human sea were stilled. A man, lean, angular, with coat tail, flapping unfolded like a grotesque figure at a sideshow. No confidence was there. Stooping forward, Abraham Lincoln began to speak, and Stephen Bryce hung his head and shuddered. Could this shrill falsetto be the same voice to which he had listened only that morning? Could this awkward, yellow man with his hands behind his back be he whom he had worshipped? Ripples of derisive laughter rose here and there, on the stand and from the crowd. Thrice distilled was the agony of those moments. But what was this feeling that gradually crept over him? Surprise? Cautiously he raised his eyes. The hands were coming around to the front. Suddenly one of them was thrown sharply back, With a determined gesture, the head was raised, and his shame was forgotten. In its stead wonder was come. But soon he lost even that, for his mind was gone on a journey. And when again he came to himself and looked upon Abraham Lincoln, this was a man transformed. The voice was no longer shrill. Nay, it was now a powerful instrument which played strangely on those who heard. Now it rose, and again it fell into tones so low as to start a stir which spread and spread, like a ripple in a pond, until it broke on the very edge of that vast audience. Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state? Constitution? It was out, at last, irrevocably writ in the recording book of history, for better, for worse, beyond the reach of politician, committee, or caucus. But what man amongst those who heard and stirred might say that these minutes, even now basting into eternity, held the crisis of a nation that is the hope of the world? Not you, Judge Douglas, who sit there smiling. Consternation is a stranger in your heart. But answer the question if you can. Yes, your nimble wit has helped you out of many a tight corner. You do not feel the noose as yet. You do not guess that your reply will make or mar the fortunes of your country. It is not you who can look ahead 2 short years and see the ship of democracy splitting on the rocks at Charleston and at Baltimore, when the power of your name might have steered her safely. But see, what is this man about whom you despise? One by one he is taking the screws out of the engine which you have invented to run your ship. Look, he holds them in his hands without mixing them, and shows the false construction of its secret parts. For Abraham Lincoln dealt with abstruse questions in language so limpid that many a farmer, dulled by toil, heard and understood and marveled. The simplicity of the Bible dwells in those speeches, and they are now classics in our literature. And the wonder in Stephen's mind was that this man who could be a buffoon, whose speech was coarse and whose person unkempt, could prove himself a tower of morality and truth. That has troubled many another, before and since the debate at Freeport. That short hour came all too quickly to an end. And as the moderator gave the signal for Mr. Lincoln, it was Stephen's big companion who snapped the strain, and voiced the sentiment of those about him. "By gosh!" he cried. "He baffles Steve. I didn't think Abe had it in him." The Honorable Stephen A. Douglas, however, seemed anything but baffled as he rose to reply. As he waited for the cheers which greeted him to die out, his attitude was easy and indifferent, as a public man's should be. The question seemed not to trouble him in the least. But for Stephen Bryce, the judge stood there stripped of the glamour that made him, even as Abraham Lincoln had stripped his doctrine of its paint and colors, and left it punily naked. Standing up, the very person of the little giant was contradictory, as was the man himself. His height was insignificant, but he had the head and shoulders of a lion, and even the lion's roar. What at contrast the ring of his deep bass to the tentative falsetto of Mr. Lincoln's opening words. If Stephen expected the judge to tremble, he was greatly disappointed. Mr. Douglas was far from dismay. As if to show the people how lightly he held his opponent's warnings, he made them gape by putting things down Mr. Lincoln's shirt front and taking them out of his mouth. But it appeared to Stephen, listening with all his might, that the judge was a trifle more on the defensive than his attitude might lead one to expect. Was he not among his own Northern Democrats at Freeport? And yet it seemed to give him a keen pleasure to call his hearers black Republicans. Not black, came from the crowd again and again, and once a man shouted, "Couldn't you modify it and call it brown?" "Not a whit," cried the judge, and dubbed them Yankees. Although himself a Vermonter by birth, he implied that most of these black Republicans desired Negro wives. But quick, to the question, how was the little giant, artful in debate as he was, to get over that without offense to the Great South? Very skillfully the judge disposed of the first of the interrogations. And then, save for the gusts of wind rustling the trees, the grove might have been empty of its thousands. Such was the silence that fell. But tighter and tighter they pressed against the stand, until it trembled. "O Judge, the time of all artful men will come at length. How were you to foresee a certain day under the white dome of the Capitol? Had your sight been long, you would have paused before your answer. Had your sight been long, you would have seen this ugly Lincoln bareheaded before the nation, and you are holding his hat. Judge Douglas, this act alone has redeemed your faults. It has given you a nobility of which we did not suspect you. At the end God gave you strength to be humble, and so you left the name of a patriot. Judge, you thought there was a passage between Scylla and Charybdis which your craftiness might overcome. It matters not, you cried when you answered the question. It matters not which way the Supreme Court may hereafter decide as to the abstract question whether slavery may or may not go into a territory under the Constitution. The people have the lawful means to introduce or to exclude it as they please, for the reason that slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations. Judge Douglas, uneasy will you lie tonight, for you have uttered the Freeport heresy. It only remains to be told how Stephen Bryce, coming to the Brewster house after the debate, found Mr. Lincoln. On his knee, in transports of delight, was a small boy, and Mr. Lincoln was serenely playing on the child's Jew's harp. Standing beside him was a proud father who had dragged his son across 2 counties in a farm wagon, and who was to return on the morrow to enter this event in the family Bible. In a corner of the room were several impatient gentlemen of influence who wished to talk about the question. But when he saw Stephen, Mr. Lincoln looked up with a smile of welcome that is still, and ever will be, remembered and cherished. Tell Judge Whipple that I have attended to that little matter, Steve, he said. Why, Mr. Lincoln, he exclaimed, you have had no time. I have taken the time, Mr. Lincoln replied, and I think that I am well repaid. Steve, said he, unless I'm mightily mistaken, you know a little more than you did yesterday. Yes, sir, I do, said Stephen. Come, Steve, said Mr. Lincoln. Be honest. Didn't you feel sorry for me last night? Stephen flushed scarlet. I never shall again, sir, he said. The wonderful smile, so ready to come and go, flickered and went out. In its stead on the strange face was ineffable sadness. The sadness of the world's tragedies, of Stephen stoned, of Christ crucified. Pray God that you may feel sorry for me again, he said. Awed, the child on his lap was still. The politician had left the room. Mr. Lincoln had kept Stephen's hand in his own. I have hopes of you, Stephen, he said. Do not forget me. Stephen Bryce never has. Why was it that he walked to the station with a heavy heart? It was a sense of the man he had left, who had been and was to be. This Lincoln of the Black Loam, who built his neighbor's cabin and hoed his neighbor's corn, who had been storekeeper and postmaster and flatboatman, who had followed a rough judge dealing a rough justice around a rough circuit, who had rolled a local bully in the dirt, rescued women from insult, tended the bedside of many a sick coward who feared the judgment, told coarse stories on barrels by candlelight, but these are pure beside the vice of great cities, who addressed political mobs in the raw, swooping down from the stump and flinging embroilers east and west. This physician who was one day to tend the sickbed of the nation in her agony, whose large hand was to be on her feeble pulse, and whose knowledge almost divine was to perform the miracle of her healing. So was it that the physician himself performed his cures, and when work was done, died a martyr. Abraham Lincoln died in his name. Chapter 19. Glencoe. It was nearly noon when Stephen walked into the office the next day, dusty and travel-worn and perspiring. He had come straight from the ferry without going home, and he had visions of a quiet dinner with Richter under the trees at the beer garden, where he could talk about Abraham Lincoln. Had Richter ever heard of Lincoln? But the young German met him at the top of the stair, and his face was more serious than usual, although he showed his magnificent teeth in a smile of welcome. You are a little behind your time, my friend, said he. What has happened you? Didn't the judge get Mr. Lincoln's message? Asked Stephen with anxiety. The German shrugged his shoulders. Ah, I know not, he answered. He has gone as Glencoe. The judge is ill, Stephen. Dr. Polk says that he has worked all his life too hard. The doctor and Colonel Carville tried to get him to go to Glencoe, but he would not budge until Miss Carville herself comes all the way from the country yesterday, and orders him. Exclaimed Richter, impulsively. What wonderful women you have in America! I could lose my head when I think of Miss Carville. Miss Carville was here, you say? Stephen repeated in a tone of inquiry. Donner, said Richter, disgusted. You don't care. Stephen laughed in spite of himself. Why should I? He answered, and becoming grave again added, except on Judge Whipple's account. Have you heard from him today, Carl? This morning one of Colonel Carville's servants came for his letters. He must be feeling better. I pray that he is better, said Richter, his voice breaking. He has been very good to me. Stephen said nothing, but he had been conscious all at once of an affection for the judge of which he had not suspected himself. That afternoon, on his way home, he stopped at Carville and Company's to inquire. Mr. Whipple was better, so Mr. Hopper said, and added that he presumed likely the colonel would not be in for a week. It was then Saturday. Eliphalet was actually in the colonel's sanctum behind the partition, giving orders to several clerks at the time. He was so prosperous and important that he could scarce spare a moment to answer Stephen, who went away wondering whether he had been wise to choose the law. On Monday, when Stephen called at Carville and Company's, Eliphalet was too busy to see him. But Ephraim, who went out to Glencoe every night with orders, told him that the jedge was was Sioux. On Wednesday, there being little change, Mrs. Bryce ventured to dispatch a jelly by Ephraim. On Friday afternoon, when Stephen was deep in Whittlesea and the new code, he became aware of Ephraim standing beside him. In reply to his anxious question, Ephraim answered, I reckon he better, Sue. He and de Colonel Dunn commence rastlin' 'bout a man named Lincoln. De Colonel Dunn wrote you dis note, Sue. It was a very polite note, containing the colonel's compliments, asking Mr. Bryce to Glencoe that afternoon with whatever papers or letters the judge might wish to see. And since there was no convenient train in the evening, Colonel Carville would feel honored if Mr. Bryce would spend the night. The colonel mentioned the train on which Mr. Bryce was expected. The Missouri side of the Mississippi is a very different country from the hot and treeless prairies of Illinois. As Stephen alighted at the little station at Glencoe and was driven away by Ned in the colonel's buggy, he drew in deep breaths of the sweet air of the Merrimack Valley. There had been a shower, and the sun glistened on the drops on grass and flowers, and the great trees hung heavy over the clay road. At last they came to a white gate in the picket fence, in sight of a rambling wooden house with a veranda in front covered with honeysuckle. And then he saw the colonel, in white Marseilles, smoking a cigar. This indeed was real country. As Stephen trod the rough flags between the high grass which led toward the house, Colonel Carville rose to his full height and greeted him. You are very welcome, sir, he said gravely. The judge is asleep now, he added. I regret to say that we had a little argument this morning, and my daughter tells me it will be well not to excite him again today. Ginny is reading to him now, or she would be here to entertain you, Mr. Bryce. Jackson, cried Mr. Carville, show Mr. Bryce to his room. Jackson appeared hurriedly, seized Stephen's bag, and led the way upstairs through the cool and darkened house to a pretty little room on the south side, with matting and roses on the simple dressing table. After he had sat a while staring at these, and at the wet flower garden from between the slats of his shutters, he removed the signs of the railroad upon him and descended. The colonel was still on the porch in his easy-chair. He had lighted another cigar, and on the stand beside him stood 2 tall glasses, green with the fresh mint. Colonel Carville rose, and with his own hand offered one to Stephen. Your health, Mr. Bryce, he said, and I hope you will feel at home here, sir. Jackson will bring you anything you desire, and should you wish to drive, I shall be delighted to show you the country. Stephen drank that julep with reverence, and then the colonel gave him a cigar. He was quite overcome by this treatment of a penniless young Yankee. The colonel did not talk politics. Such was not his notion of hospitality to a stranger. He talked horse, and no great discernment on Stephen's part was needed to perceive that this was Mr. Carville's hobby. I used to have a stable, Mr. Bryce, before they ruined gentlemen's sport with these trotters 10 years ago. Yes, sir, we used to be at Lexington one week and Louisville the next and over here on the Ames track after that. Did you ever hear of Water, Witch, and Nettie Boone? Yes, Stephen had, from Mr. Jack Brinsmaid. The colonel's face beamed. Why, sir, he cried. That very nigger, Ned, who drove you here from the cars, he used to ride Nettie Boone. Would you believe that, Mr. Bryce? He was the best jockey ever strode a horse on the Ellardsville track here. He wore my yellow and green, sir, until he got to weigh 125. And I kept him down to that weight a whole year, Mr. Bryce. Yes, sirree, a whole year. Kept him down, said Stephen. Why, yes, sir. I had him wrapped in blankets and set in a chair with holes bored in the seat. Then we lighted a spirit lamp under him. Many a time I took off 10 pounds that way. It needs fire to get flesh off a nigger, sir. He didn't notice his guest's amazement. Then, sir, he continued, they introduced these damned trotting races. Trotting races are for white trash, Mr. Bryce. Pa! The colonel stopped short. Stephen was already on his feet. I wish you could have seen Miss Virginia Carville as he saw her then. She wore a white lawn dress. A tea tray was in her hand, and her head was tilted back, as women are apt to do when they carry a burden. It was so that these Southern families, who were so bitter against abolitionists and Yankees, entertained them when they were poor and nursed them when they were ill. Stephen, for his life, could not utter a word. But Virginia turned to him with perfect self-possession. He has been boring you with his horses, Mr. Bryce, she said. Has he told you what a jockey Ned used to be before he weighed 125? A laugh. Has he given you the points of Water Witch and Nettie Boone? More laughter. Increasing embarrassment for Stephen. Pa! I tell you once more that you will drive every guest from this house. Your jockey talk is intolerable. Oh, that you might have a notion of the way in which Virginia pronounced intolerable. Mr. Carville reached for another cigar, asked, My dear, he asked, how is the judge? My dear, said Virginia, smiling. He is asleep. Mammy Easter is with him, trying to make out what he is saying. He talks in his sleep, just as you do. And what is he saying? Demanded the colonel, interested. Virginia set down the tray. A house divided against itself, said Miss Carville, with a sweep of her arm, cannot stand. I believe that this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to dissolve. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. Would you like any more? Added Miss Virginia. No, cried the colonel, and banged his fist down on the table. Why? Said he, thoughtfully, stroking the white goatee on his chin. Cuss me if that ain't from the speech that country bumpkin, Lincoln, made in June last before the Black Republican Convention in Illinois. Virginia broke again into laughter, and Stephen was very near it, for he loved the colonel. That gentleman suddenly checked himself in his tirade, and turned to him. I beg your pardon, sir, he said. I reckon that you have the same political sentiments as the judge. Believe me, sir, I would not willingly offend a guest. Stephen smiled. I am not offended, sir, he said, a speech which caused Mr. Carville to bestow a quick glance upon him. But Stephen did not see it. He was looking at Virginia. The colonel rose. You will pardon my absence for a while, sir, he said. My daughter will entertain you. In silence they watched him as he strode off under the trees through tall grass, a yellow setter at his heels. A strange peace was over Stephen. The shadows of the walnuts and hickories were growing long, and a rich country was giving up its scent to the evening air. From a cabin behind the house was wafted the melody of a plantation song. To the young man after the burnt city this was paradise. And then he remembered his mother as she must be sitting on the tiny porch in town, and sighed. Only 2 years ago she had been at their own place at Westbury. He looked up and saw the girl watching him. He dared not think that the expression he caught was one of sympathy, for it changed instantly. I am afraid you are the silent kind, Mr. Bryce, said she. I believe it is a Yankee trait. Stephen laughed. I have known a great many who were not, said he. When they are garrulous, they are very much so. I should prefer a garrulous one, said Virginia. I should think a Yankee were bad enough, but a noisy Yankee not to be put up with, he ventured. Virginia did not deign a direct reply to this, save by the corners of her mouth. I wonder, said she thoughtfully, whether it is strength of mind or a lack of ideas that makes them silent. It is mostly prudence, said Mr. Bryce. Prudence is our dominant trait. Virginia fidgeted. Usually she had an easier time. You have not always shown it, she said, with an innocence which in women is often charged with meaning. Stephen started. Her antagonism was still there. He would have liked greatly to know whether she referred to his hasty purchase of Hester, or to his rashness in dancing with her at her party the winter before. We have something left to be thankful for, he answered. We are still capable of action. On occasions it is violence, said Virginia, desperately. This man must not get ahead of her. It is just as violent, said he, as the repressed feeling which prompts it. This was a new kind of conversation to Virginia. Of all the young men she knew, not one had ever ventured into anything of the sort. They were either flippant or sentimental or both. She was at once flattered and annoyed. Flattered, because, as a woman, Stephen had conceded her a mind. Many of the young men she knew had minds, but deemed that these were wasted on women, whose language was generally supposed to be a kind of childish twaddle. Even Jack Brinsmaid rarely risked his dignity and reputation at an intellectual tilt. This was one of Virginia's grievances. She often argued with her father, and, if the truth were told, had had more than one victory over Judge Whipple. Virginia's annoyance came from the fact that she perceived in Stephen a natural and merciless logic, a faculty for getting at the bottom of things. His brain did not seem to be thrown out of gear by local magnetic influences, by beauty, for instance. He did not lose his head, as did some others she knew, at the approach of feminine charms. Here was a grand subject, then, to try the mettle of any woman. One with less mettle would have given it up. But Virginia thought it would be delightful to bring this particular Yankee to his knees, and leave him there. Mr. Bryce, she said, I have not spoken to you since the night of my party. I believe we danced together. Yes, we did, said he. And I called, but was unfortunate. You called? Ah, Virginia. They did not tell you, cried Stephen. Now Miss Carville was complacency itself. Jackson is so careless with cards, said she, and very often I do not take the trouble to read them. I am sorry, said he, as I wished for the opportunity to tell you how much I enjoyed myself. I have found everybody in St. Louis very kind to strangers. Virginia was nearly disarmed. She remembered how she had opposed his coning, but honesty as well as something else prompted her to say, It was my father who invited you. Stephen did not reveal the shock his vanity had received. At least you were good enough to dance with me. I could scarcely refuse a guest, she replied. He held up his head. Had I thought it would have given you annoyance, he said quietly, I should not have asked you, which would have been a lack of good manners, said Virginia, biting her lips. Stephen answered nothing, but wished himself in St. Louis. He could not comprehend her cruelty. But, just then, the bell rang for supper, and the colonel appeared around the end of the house. It was one of those suppers for which the South is renowned. And when at length he could induce Stephen to eat no more, Colonel Carville reached for his broad-brimmed felt hat, and sat smoking with his feet against the mantel. Virginia, who had talked but little, disappeared with a tray on which she had placed with her own hands some dainties to tempt the judge. The colonel regaled Stephen, when she was gone, with the pedigree and performance of every horse he had had in his stable. And this was a relief, as it gave him an opportunity to think without interruption upon Virginia's pronounced attitude of dislike. To him it was inconceivable that a young woman of such qualities as she appeared to have should assail him so persistently for freeing a negress, and so depriving her of a maid she had set her heart upon. There were other New England young men in society, Mr. Weston and Mr. Carpenter and more. They were not her particular friends, to be sure, but they called on her and danced with her, and she had shown them not the least antipathy. But it was to Stephen's credit that he did not analyze her further. He was reflecting on these things when he got to his room, when there came a knock at the door. It was Mammy Easter, in bright turban and apron. Was hospitality and comfort in the flesh. Is you got all you need, Sue? She inquired. Stephen replied that he had. But Mammy showed no inclination to go, and he was too polite to shut the door. How you like Glencoe, Mr. Bride? He was charmed with it. "We has some of de fust families out here in de summer," said she. "But de Colonel, he ain't much on a grand place lake in Kentuck." "Shucks, no, Sue. Dis ain't much of a 'stablishment. Young massa won't have no lawns, no greenhouses, no nothin'. He say he lake it will and simple. He on'y come out fo 2 months, meb. But Miss Jinny, she make it lively. Last week, until the jedge come, we have dis house chuck full. 2-3 young ladies in a room, and 5 young gemmen on trunnel beds." "Until the judge came?" echoed Stephen. "Yasu. Den Miss Jinny lo day all had her go. She say she ain't gwinneter have noun sturbin a sick man." De Colonel monstrated. "He done give the judge his big room, and he say he and de young men gwine ober to Mr. Catherwood's. You ain't never seen Miss Jinny rise up, Sue. She de swep all out." Mammy emphasized this by rolling her hands. "And Dekla she gwine tend to the jedge herself. She ain't never let me bring up one of his meals, Sue." And so she left Stephen with some food for reflection. Virginia was very gay at breakfast and said that the judge would see Stephen. So he and the Colonel, that gentleman with his hat on, went up to his room. The shutters were thrown open, and the morning sunlight filtered through the leaves and fell on the four-poster where the judge sat up, gaunt and grizzled as ever. He smiled at his host, and then tried to destroy immediately the effect of the smile. "Well, Judge," cried the Colonel, taking his hand, "I reckon we talked too much." "No such thing, Carville," said the judge forcibly. "If you hadn't left the room, your popular sovereignty would have been in rags in 2 minutes." Stephen sat down in a corner, unobserved, in expectation of a renewal. But at this moment Miss Virginia swept into the room, very cool in a pink muslin. "Colonel Carville," said she sternly, "I am the doctor's deputy here. I was told to keep the peace at any cost. And if you answer back, out you go like that." And she snapped her fingers. The Colonel laughed. But the judge, whose mind was on the argument, continued to mutter defiantly until his eye fell upon Stephen. Well, sir, he said. "You've turned up at last, have you? I send you off with papers for a man, and I get back a piece of yellow paper saying that he's borrowed you. What did he do with you, Mr. Bryce?" "He took me to Freeport, sir, where I listened to the most remarkable speech I ever expect to hear." "What?" cried the judge. "So far from Boston?" Stephen hesitated, uncertain whether to laugh, until he chanced to look at Virginia. She had pursed her lips. "I was very much surprised, sir," he said. "Humph!" grunted Mr. Whipple. "And what did you chink of that ruffian Lincoln?" "He is the most remarkable man that I have ever met, sir," answered Stephen with emphasis. "Humph!" It seemed as if the grunt this time had in it something of approval. Stephen had doubt as to the propriety of discussing Mr. Lincoln there, and he reddened. Virginia's expression bore a trace of defiance, and Mr. Carville stood with his feet apart, thoughtfully stroking his goatee. But Mr. Whipple seemed to have no scruples. "So you admired Lincoln, Mr. Bryce?" he went on. "You must agree with that laudatory estimation of him which I read in the Missouri Democrat." Stephen fidgeted. "I do, sir, most decidedly," he answered. "I should hardly expect a conservative Bostonian, of the class which respects property, to have said that. It might possibly be a good thing if more from your town could hear those debates. They will read them, sir. I feel confident of it." At this point the Colonel could contain himself no longer. "I reckon I might tell the man who wrote that Democrat article a few things, if I could find out who he is," said he. "Pah!" said Virginia warningly, but Stephen had turned a fiery red. "I wrote it, Colonel Carville," he said. For a dubious instant of silence Colonel Carville stared. Then he slapped his knees, broke into a storm of laughter, and went out of the room. He left Stephen in a moist state of discomfiture. The judge had bolted upright from the pillows. "You have been neglecting your law, sir," he cried. "I wrote the article at night," said Stephen indignantly. "Then it must have been Sunday night, Mr. Bryce." At this point Virginia hid her face in her handkerchief, which trembled visibly. Being a woman whose ways are unaccountable, the older man took no notice of her. But being a young woman, "And a pretty one." Stephen was angry. "I don't see what right you have to ask me that, sir," he said. "The question is withdrawn, Mr. Bryce," said the judge. "Virginia, you may strike it from the records. And now, sir, tell me something about your trip." Virginia departed. An hour later Stephen descended to the veranda, and it was with apprehension that he discerned Mr. Carville seated under the vines at the far end. Virginia was perched on the railing. To Stephen's surprise the colonel rose, and, coming toward him, laid a kindly hand on his shoulder. "Stephen," said he, "there will be no law until Monday. You must stay with us until then. A little rest will do you good." Stephen was greatly touched. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I should like to very much, but I can't." "Nonsense," said the colonel. "I won't let the judge interfere." "It isn't that, sir. I shall have to go by the 2 o'clock train, I fear." The colonel turned to Virginia, who, meanwhile, had sat silently by. "Ginny," he said, "we must contrive to keep him." She slid off the railing. "I'm afraid he is determined, Pa," she answered. "But perhaps Mr. Bryce would like to see a little of the place before he goes. It is very primitive," she explained. "Not much like yours in the East." Stephen thanked her and bowed to the colonel, and so she led him past the low, crooked outbuildings at the back, where he saw old Uncle Ben busy over the preparation of his dinner, and frisky Rosetta, his daughter, playing with one of the colonel's setters. Then Virginia took a well-worn path, on each side of which the high grass bent with its load of seed, which entered the wood. Oaks and hickories and walnuts and persimmons spread out in a glade, and the wild grape twisted fantastically around the trunks. All this beauty seemed but a fit setting to the strong girlish figure in the pink frock before him. So absorbed was he in contemplation of this, and in wondering whether indeed she were to marry her cousin, Clarence Colfax, that he did not see the wonders of view unrolling in front of him. She stopped at length beside a great patch of wild race bushes. They were on the edge of the bluff, and in front of them a little rustic summer house, with seats on its 5 sides. Here Virginia sat down, but Stephen, going to the edge, stood and marveled. Far, far below him, down the wooded steep, shot the crystal Merrimack, chafing over the shallow gravel beds and tearing headlong at the deep passes. Beyond, the dimpled green hills rose and fell, and the stream ran indigo and silver. A hawk soared over the water, the only living creature in all that wilderness. The glory of the place stirred his blood, and when at length he turned, he saw that the girl was watching him. "It is very beautiful," he said. Virginia had taken other young men here, and they had looked only upon her. And yet she was not offended. This sincerity now was as new to her as that with which he had surprised her in the judge's room. And she was not quite at her ease. A reply to those simple words of his was impossible. At honest Tom Catherwood in the same situation she would have laughed. Clarence never so much as glanced at scenery. Her replies to him were either flippant or else maternal as to a child. A breeze laden with the sweet abundance of that valley stirred her hair, and with that womanly gesture which has been the same through the ages she put up her hand, deftly tucking in the stray wisp behind. She glanced at the New Englander, against whom she had been in strange rebellion since she had first seen him. His face, thinned by the summer in town, was of the sternness of the Puritan. Stephen's features were sharply marked for his age. The will to conquer was there, yet justice was in the mouth, and greatness of heart. Conscience was graven on the broad forehead. The eyes were the blue-gray of the flint, kindly yet imperishable. The face was not handsome. Struggling, then yielding to the impulse, Virginia let herself be led on into the years. Sanity was the word that best described him. She saw him trusted of men, honored of women, feared by the false. She saw him in high places, simple, reserved, poised evenly as he was now. "Why do you go in this afternoon?" she asked abruptly. He started at the change in her tone. "I wish that I might stay," he said regretfully. "But I cannot, Miss Carville." He gave no reason, and she was too proud to ask it. Never before had she stooped to urge young men to stay. The difficulty had always been to get them to go. It was natural, perhaps, that her vanity was wounded. But it hurt her to think that she had made the overture, had tried to conquer whatever it was that set her against him, and had failed through him. You must find the city attractive. Perhaps, she added with a little laugh, perhaps it is Bellefontaine Road. No, he answered, smiling. Then, with a touch of derision, then it is because you cannot miss an afternoon's work. You are that kind. I was not always that kind, he answered. I did not work at Harvard. But now I have to or starve, he said. For the second time his complete simplicity had disarmed her. He had not appealed to her sympathy, nor had he hinted at the luxury in which he was brought up. She would have liked to question Stephen on this former life. But she changed the subject suddenly. What did you really think of Mr. Lincoln? She asked. I thought him the ugliest man I ever saw, and the handsomest as well. But you admired him? Yes, said Stephen gravely. You believe with him that this government cannot exist half slave and half free. Then a day will come, Mr. Bryce, when you and I shall be foreigners one to the other. You have forgotten, he said eagerly. You have forgotten the rest of the quotation. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Virginia laughed. That seemed to me very equivocal, said she. Your rail-sputter is well named. Will you read the rest of that speech? He asked. Judge Whipple is very clever. He has made a convert of you, she answered. The judge has had nothing to do with it, cried Stephen. He is not given to discussion with me, and until I went to Springfield had never mentioned Lincoln's name to me. Glancing at her, he surprised a sparkle of amusement in her eyes. Then she laughed openly. Why do you suppose that you were sent to Springfield? She asked. With an important communication for Mr. Lincoln, he answered. And that most important communication was yourself. There now I have told you, said Virginia. Was myself? I don't understand. Virginia puckered her lips. Then you haven't the sense I thought you had, she replied impatiently. Do you know what was in that note? No? Well, a year ago last June this black Republican lawyer whom you are all talking of made a speech before a convention in Illinois. Judge Whipple has been crazy on the subject ever since. He talks of Lincoln in his sleep. He went to Springfield and spent 2 days with him, and now he can't rest until you have seen and known and heard him. So he writes a note to Lincoln and asks him to take you to the debate. She paused again to laugh at his amazement. But he told me to go to Springfield, he exclaimed. He told you to find Lincoln. He knew that you would obey his orders, I suppose. But I didn't know, Stephen began, trying to compass within an instant the memory of his year's experience with Mr. Whipple. You didn't know that he thought anything about you, said Virginia. That is his way, Mr. Bryce. He has more private charities on his list than any man in the city except Mr. Brinsmade. Very few know it. He thinks a great deal of you. But there, she added, suddenly blushing crimson, I am sorry I told you. Why? He asked. She did not answer, but sat tapping the seat with her fingers. And when she ventured to look at him, he had fallen into thought. I think it must be time for dinner, said Virginia. If you really wish to catch the train. The coldness in her voice, rather than her words, aroused him. He rose, took one lingering look at the river, and followed her to the house. At dinner, when not talking about his mare, the colonel was trying to persuade Stephen to remain. Virginia did not join in this, and her father thought the young man's refusal sprang from her lack of cordiality. Colonel Carville himself drove to the station. When he returned, he found his daughter sitting idly on the porch. I like that young man if he is a Yankee, he declared. I don't, said Virginia promptly. My dear, said her father, voicing the hospitality of the Carvilles. I am surprised at you. One should never show one's feelings toward a guest. As mistress of this house, it was your duty to press him to stay. He did not want to stay. Do you know why he went, my dear? Asked the colonel. No, said Virginia. I asked him, said the colonel. Pa, I did not think it of you, she cried. And then, what was it? She demanded. He said that his mother was alone in town and needed him. Virginia got up without a word and went into Judge Whipple's room. And there the colonel found her some hours later, reading aloud from a scrapbook certain speeches of Mr. Lincoln's which Judge Whipple had cut from newspapers. And the judge, lying back with his eyes half closed, was listening in pure delight. Little did he guess at Virginia's penance. Chapter 20. An excursion. I am going ahead 2 years. 2 years during which a nation struggled in agony with sickness, and even the great strength with which she was endowed at birth was not equal to the task of throwing it off. In 1620 a Dutch ship had brought from Guinea to His Majesty's colony of Virginia the germs of that disease for which the nation's blood was to be let so freely. During these years signs of dissolution, of death, were not wanting. In the city by the Father of Waters where the races met, men and women were born into the world, who were to die in ancient Cuba, who were to be left fatherless in the struggle soon to come, who were to live to see new monsters rise to gnaw at the vitals of the Republic, and to hear again the cynical laugh of Europe. But they were also to see their country a power in the world, perchance the greatest power. While Europe had wrangled, the child of the West had grown into manhood and taken a seat among the highest, to share with them the responsibilities of manhood. Meanwhile, Stephen Bryce had been given permission to practice law in the sovereign state of Missouri. Stephen understood Judge Whipple better. It cannot be said that he was intimate with that rather formidable personage, although the judge, being a man of habits, had formed that of taking tea at least once a week with Mrs. Bryce. Stephen had learned to love the judge, and he had never ceased to be grateful to him for a knowledge of that man who had had the most influence upon his life, Abraham Lincoln. For the seed, sowed in wisdom and self-denial, was bearing fruit. The sound of gathering conventions was in the land, and the Freeport heresy was not forgotten. We shall not mention the number of clients thronging to Mr. Whipple's office to consult Mr. Bryce. These things are humiliating. Some of Stephen's income came from articles in the newspapers of that day. What funny newspapers they were, the size of a blanket. No startling headlines such as we see now, but a continued novel among the advertisements on the front page and verses from some gifted lady of the town, signed Electra. And often a story of pure love, but more frequently of ghosts or other eerie phenomena taken from a magazine, or an anecdote of a cat or a chicken. There were letters from citizens who had the mania of print, bulletins of different ages from all parts of the Union, clippings out of day-before-yesterday's newspaper of Chicago or Cincinnati to 3 weeks' letters from San Francisco, come by the pony post to Lexington and then down the swift Missouri. Of course, there was news by telegraph, but that was precious as fine gold, not to be lightly read and cast aside. In the autumn of '59, through the kindness of Mr. Brinsmade, Stephen had gone on a steamboat up the river to a great convention in Iowa. On this excursion was much of St. Louis's bluest blood. He widened his circle of acquaintances, and spent much of his time walking the guards between Miss and Brinsmade and Miss Puss Russell. Perhaps it is unfair to these young ladies to repeat what they said about Stephen in the privacy of their staterooms, gentle and remonstrating that they should not gossip, and listening eagerly the while, and laughing at Miss Puss, whose mimicry of Stephen's severe ways brought tears to her eyes. Mr. Clarence Colfax was likewise on the boat, and passing Stephen on the guards, bowed distantly. But once, on the return trip, when Stephen had a writing pad on his knee, the young Southerner came up to him in his frankest manner and with an expression of the gray eyes which was not to be withstood. "Making a case, Bryce?" he said. "I hear you are the kind that cannot be idle even on a holiday." "Not as bad as all that," replied Stephen, smiling at him. "Reckon you keep a diary, then?" said Clarence, leaning against the rail. He made a remarkably graceful figure, Stephen thought. He was tall, and his movements had what might be called a commanding indolence. Stephen, while he smiled, could not but admire the tone and gesture with which Colfax bade a passing Negro to get him a handkerchief from his cabin. The alacrity of the black to do the errand was amusing enough. Stephen well knew it had not been such if he wanted a handkerchief. Stephen said it was not a diary. Mr. Colfax was too well-bred to inquire further, so he never found out that Mr. Bryce was writing an account of the convention and the speech-making for the Missouri Democrat. "Bryce," said the Southerner, "I want to apologize for things I've done to you and said about you. I hated you for a long time after you beat me out of Hester. And he hesitated. Stephen looked up. For the first time he actually liked Colfax. He had been long enough among Colfax's people to understand how difficult it was for him to say the thing he wished. You may remember a night at my uncle's, Colonel Carville's, on the occasion of my cousin's birthday? Yes, said Stephen in surprise. Well, blurted Clarence boyishly. I was rude to you in my uncle's house and I have since been sorry. He held out his hand, and Stephen took it warmly. I was younger then, Mr. Colfax, he said, and I didn't understand your point of view as well as I do now. Not that I have changed my ideas, he added quickly, but the notion of the girls going south angered me. I was bidding against the dealer rather than against you. Had I then known Miss Carville? He stopped abruptly. The winning expression died from the face of the other. He turned away, and leaning across the rail, stared at the high bluffs, red-bronzed by the autumn sun. A score of miles beyond that precipice was a long, low building of stone, surrounded by spreading trees. The school for young ladies, celebrated throughout the West, where our mothers and grandmothers were taught, Monticello. Hither Miss Virginia Carville had gone, some 30 days since, for her second winter. Perhaps Stephen guessed the thought in the mind of his companion, for he stared also. The music in the cabin came to an abrupt pause, and only the tumbling of waters through the planks of the great wheels broke the silence. They were both startled by laughter at their shoulders. There stood Miss Russell, the picture of merriment, her arm locked in and bridesmaids. It is the hour when all devout worshippers turn towards the east, she said. The goddess is enshrined at Monticello. Both young men, as they got to their feet, were crimson, whereupon Miss Russell laughed again, and however blushed for them. But this was not the first time Miss Russell had gone too far. Young Mr. Colfax, with the excess of manner which was his at such times, excused himself and left abruptly. This to the further embarrassment of Stephen and Anne, and the keener enjoyment of Miss Russell. Was I not right, Mr. Bryce? She demanded. Why, you are even writing verses to her. I scarcely know Miss Carville, he said, recovering. And as for writing verse, you never did such a thing in your life. I can well believe it. Miss Russell made a face in the direction Colfax had taken. He always acts like that when you mention her, she said. But you are so cruel, Puss, said Anne. You can't blame him. Hairpins, said Miss Russell. Isn't she to marry him? Said Stephen in his natural voice. He remembered his pronouns too late. That has been the way of the world ever since Adam and Eve, remarked Puss. I suppose you meant to ask, Mr. Bryce, whether Clarence is to marry Virginia Carville, and nudged her. My dear, what will Mr. Bryce think of us? Listen, Mr. Bryce, Puss continued, undaunted. I shall tell you some gossip. Virginia was sent to Monticello, and went with her father to Kentucky and Pennsylvania this summer, that she might be away from Clarence. Colfax. Oh, Puss, cried Anne. Miss Russell paid not the slightest heed. Colonel Carville is right, she went on. I should do the same thing. They are first cousins, and the Colonel doesn't like that. I am fond of Clarence, but he isn't good for anything in the world except horse racing and fighting. He wanted to help drive the black Republican emigrants out of Kansas, and his mother had to put a collar and chain on him. He wanted to go filibustering with Walker, and she had to get down on her knees. And yet, she cried, if you Yankees push us as far as war, Mr. Bryce, just look out for him. But, and interposed, oh, I know what you are going to say. That Clarence has money. Puss, cried Anne, outraged. How dare you? Miss Russell slipped an arm around her waist. Come, Anne, she said. We mustn't interrupt the senator any longer. He is preparing his maiden speech. That was the way in which Stephen got his nickname. It is scarcely necessary to add that he wrote no more until he reached his little room in the house on Olive Street. They had passed Alton, and the black cloud that hung in the still autumn air over the city was in sight. It was dusk when the Jackson pushed her nose into the levee, and the song of the Negro stevedores rose from below as they pulled the gangplank on to the landing stage. Stephen stood apart on the hurricane deck, gazing at the dark line of sooty warehouses. How many young men with their way to make have felt the same as he did after some pleasant excursion? The presence of a tall form beside him shook him from his reverie, and he looked up to recognize the benevolent face of Mr. Brinsmaid. "Mrs. Bryce may be anxious, Stephen, at the late hour," said he. "My carriage is here, and it will give me great pleasure to convey you to your door. Dear Mr. Brinsmaid, he is in heaven now, and knows at last the good he wrought upon earth." Of the many thoughtful charities which Stephen received from him, this one sticks firmest in his remembrance. A stranger, tired and lonely, and apart from the gay young men and women who stepped from the boat, he had been sought out by this gentleman, to whom had been given the divine gift of forgetting none. "Oh, Puss," cried Anne that evening, for Miss Russell had come to spend the night, "how could you have talked to him so? He scarcely spoke on the way up in the carriage. You have offended him." "Why should I set him upon a pedestal?" said Puss, with a thread in her mouth. "Why should you all set him upon a pedestal?" "He is only a Yankee," said Puss, tossing her head, "and not so very wonderful." "I did not say he was wonderful," replied Anne with dignity. "But you girls think him so. Emily and Eugenie and Maud. He had better marry Belle Clume. A great man, he may give some decision to that family." "Anne." "Yes. Shall I tell you a secret?" "Yes," said Anne. She was human and she was feminine. "Then, Virginia Carville is in love with him." "With Mr. Bryce?" cried astonished Anne. "She hates him. She thinks she hates him," said Miss Russell calmly, and looked up at her companion admiringly. Her two heroines were Puss and Virginia. Both had the same kind of daring, but in Puss the trait had developed into a somewhat disagreeable outspokenness which made many people dislike her. Her judgments were usually well-founded, and her prophecies had so often come to pass that and often believed in them for no other reason. "How do you know?" said Anne incredulously. "Do you remember that September, a year ago, when we were all out at Glencoe, and Judge Whipple was ill, and Virginia sent us all away and nursed him herself?" "Yes," said Anne. "And did you know that Mr. Bryce had gone out with letters when the judge was better?" "Yes," said Anne breathless. "It was a Saturday afternoon that he left, although they had begged him to stay over Sunday. Virginia had written for me to come back, and I arrived in the evening. I asked Easter where Ginny was, and I found her." "You found her?" said Anne. "Sitting alone in the summer house over the river. Easter said she had been there for 2 hours. And I have never known Ginny to be such miserable company as she was that night." "Did she mention Stephen?" asked Anne. "No, but you did," said Anne with conviction. Miss Russell's reply was not as direct as usual. "You know Virginia never confides unless she wants to," she said, and considered. "Virginia has scarcely seen him since then," she said. "You know that I was her roommate at Monticello last year, and I think I should have discovered it." "Did she speak of him?" demanded Miss Russell. "Only when the subject was mentioned. I heard her repeat once what Judge Whipple told her father of him, that he had a fine legal mind. He was often in my letters from home because they have taken Pa's house next door, and because Pa likes them. I used to read those letters to Ginny," said Anne, "but she never expressed any desire to hear them." "I, too, used to write Ginny about him," confessed Puss. "Did she answer your letter?" "No," replied Miss Puss. "But that was just before the holidays, you remember. And then the Colonel hurried her off to see her Pennsylvania relatives, and I believe they went to Annapolis, too, where the Carvilles come from." Stephen, sitting in the next house, writing out his account, little dreamed that he was the subject of a conference in the third-story front of the Brinsmaids. Later, when the young ladies were asleep, he carried his manuscript to the Democrat office and delivered it into the hands of his friend, the night editor, who was awaiting it. Toward the end of that week, Miss Virginia Carville was sitting with her back to one of the great trees at Monticello reading a letter. Every once in a while she tucked it under her cloak and glanced hastily around. It was from Miss and Brinsmaid. "I have told you all about the excursion, my dear, and how we missed you. You may remember, and the guile there is in the best of us. You may remember Mr. Stephen Bryce, whom we used to speak of. Pa and Ma take a great interest in him, and Pa had him invited on the excursion. He is more serious than ever, since he has become a full-fledged lawyer. But he has a dry humor which comes out when you know him well, of which I did not suspect him. His mother is the dearest lady I have ever known, so quiet, so dignified, and so well-bred. They come in to supper very often. And the other night Mr. Bryce told Pa so many things about the people south of Market Street, the Germans, which he did not know, that Pa was astonished. He told all about German history, and how they were persecuted at home and why they came here. Pa was surprised to hear that many of them were university men, and that they were already organizing to defend the Union. I heard Pa say, "That is what Mr. Blair meant when he assured me that we need not fear for the city." Ginny dear, I ought not to have written you this, because you are for secession, and in your heart you think Pa a traitor, because he comes from a slave state and has slaves of his own. But I shall not tear it up. It is sad to think how rich Mrs. Bryce lived in Boston, and what she has had to come to. One servant and a little house and no place to go to in the summer, when they used to have such a large one. I often go in to sew with her, but she has never once mentioned her past to me. Your father has no doubt sent you the Democrat with the account of the convention. It is the fullest published by far, and was so much admired that Pa asked the editor who wrote it. Who do you think but Stephen Bryce? So now Pa knows why Mr. Bryce hesitated when Pa asked him to go up the river, and then consented. This is not the end. Yesterday, when I went in to see Mrs. Bryce, a new black silk was on her bed, and as long as I live I shall never forget how sweet was her voice when she said, "It is a surprise from my son, my dear. I did not expect ever to have another. Ginny, I just know he bought it with the money he got for the article." That was what he was writing on the boat when Clarence Colfax interrupted him. Puss accused him of writing verses to you. At this point Miss Virginia Carville stopped reading. Whether she had read that part before, who shall say? But she took Anne's letter between her fingers and tore it into bits and flung the bits into the wind, so that they were tossed about and lost among the dead leaves under the great trees. And when she reached her room, there was the hated Missouri Democrat lying, still open, on her table. A little later a great black piece of it came tossing out of the chimney above, to the affright of little Miss Brown, teacher of literature, who was walking in the grounds, and who ran to the principal's room with the story that the chimney was afire. Thank you for listening to Part 4 of The Crisis by Winston Churchill. The story continues in Part 5. Stay tuned and subscribe to Voxlore, so you don't miss the next chapter of this American classic.